fantastic introduction, and it's so great to see so many people here and so many familiar faces as well. And I just want to give a shout out for two of our friends who've travelled from Canada, actually from Vancouver, to come here this evening. That's Harley and Eleanor, who were previous students of Tim Lang's, and you're very, very welcome, and thanks for coming along. And I also want to just say how, I mean, the recruitment and the positions that Karina's just mentioned is just an indication, I think, of the kind of really, interest in this space of food policy. And this unit here at City University is really leading the kind of dialogue and the work in this particular space. I also was thanks to Karina for mentioning my experience at Divine Chocolate, because this part of London has got fond memories for me, because when we set up Divine back in 1998, our office was just round the corner from here. It was in a small rented office in Clerkenwell Road, and I used to walk down, from the Angel tube station on most days. And what's interesting about that business is that it started off with only 4 people. And we kind of changed the chocolate market. If you look at the chocolate market now, 60% of all cocoa is certified. Yet, as I'll mention later, still a lot of smallholder cocoa farmers in Ghana are still living off less than, still living on less than $1 a day. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about what's different about making policy in the food system. I'm also going to talk about the challenges. There's a consensus in the academic literature that the food system is as vulnerable now as it has been for a long time. And then I'm going to talk about some of the kind of concepts, food systems and resilience. And then going to finish off talking about the systems program team at DEFRA, just to give you an update on who's in the team, what's our objectives, and how do we see the next 12 months, 2 years panning out. So what's different about food? I think that what transfixes us all here is, setting policy in the food system is not like setting policy in automotive or electronical components industries. It's very, very complex. You've got food is sourced from different geographical scales. It's a living organic system. It's sourced from thousands of producers all over the world, and also has a temporal aspect to it as well in terms of seasonality. Plus, it's culturally bound. So, food is very important for social cohesion. It's very important for families, very important for relationships. And so, it's very, very complex and very different from setting policy, perhaps in other industrial sectors. And I think that's quite an interesting way just to think about food. It's very much a living organic system. And what I'm going to talk about now is some of the kind of vulnerabilities on the food system. So there's an increasing, consensus that the global food system is increasingly under pressure. Lots of shocks and stresses. Some of them I'm going to talk about, and there are many more. So if we talk about, first of all, if I start off with inequality. So these are the statistics from the Food and Agricultural Organization, which show that despite a period where those people suffering from hunger was in decline, we now see again over the past 2 or 3 years an increase in those particular statistics. And what's interesting, can you see the graph there? What's interesting as well is that a significant percentage of those people going hungry are actually smallholder farmers. And that's a paradox, really. And you've got emerging in the literature this notion of the hungry farmer paradox. And if you take smallholder farmers growing cocoa or growing coffee, you see an increase in decline over the past 2 years, particularly in cocoa and coffee, a real sharp decline in the world market price. And so I've just returned from Ghana. I was in Ghana with NA Agri-Food and also IFSTAL, delivering a PhD summer school, and we heard about the problems in smallholder farmers in Ghana, which is the second largest producer of cocoa in the world. And farmers were living, on average, only receiving $1 a day income. And if we know that, the extreme poverty level is $1.9 a day, it's of significant concern. So inequality is back on the increase as well, and I'll show you some other data later also. Let's have a look at health. So increasing problems in terms of the health crisis in the food system. So we have people predicting that by 2025, a fifth of all the adult population globally will be obese. And I think the figures in the UK for childhood obesity in year 6 currently is actually 20%. So these are some worrying statistics. Also, people are predicting by the year 2040 that globally there will be 700 million people who are suffering from diabetes. Again, these are really worrying statistics. Climate change. So again, this is one of those big shocks and stresses on the food system globally. Just taking one example of one particular commodity, that is Britain's favourite fruit, which is bananas. One of our sister programmes to I Know Food is based at Exeter, part of the global food security programme called Banana X. And they're looking at the impact of climate change on the UK banana supply. Now, when you walk into a UK supermarket, one of the first products you see are bananas, because in terms of stocking units, it's one of the highest rates of sale of any particular product within the UK supermarket environment. And what's happening with bananas is that increasingly they're becoming, because of changes in climatic patterns, increasingly prone to this disease called fusarium wilt, which is actually increasing its kind of incidence because of increases in moisture, increases in temperature in the banana sector. Plus, what some of you may realise is that there is only one banana variety called Cavendish, which actually supplies the UK supermarket industry. So you've got quite a challenge in terms of resilience within this particular sector. Plus, in addition to that, because of the climatic conditions, you also have this increasing incidence of this fungal disease called black sigatoka. So this is just one example. You could think of lots of other examples of climate change impacting on coffee, on cocoa. So for example, in the coffee industry, people are predicting that because of climate change, the actual usable land for coffee production will reduce by 50%. Because of the increasing temperature and people having to move further up in altitude to grow coffee. So climate change is having a real big impact on the resilience of the food system. Plus, moving on to social aspects as well, we see an increasing problem of human rights abuses in supply chains. So this is just taking one example, looking at the shrimp industry in Southeast Asia, where increasingly people are discovering, there's a recent report by the Seafood Alliance, which shows the extreme problematic conditions of workers in processing factories, particularly in Thailand, and often these factories are mainly women, working in conditions of very low wages, also problems with restricted breaks, and basically just very, very poor working conditions, and not really having the ability to form a trade association or a union. And these are in our supermarket supply chains, supplying the seafood that we eat in the United Kingdom. So just moving on, and you could think of other supply chains as well in addition to seafood, where increasingly we're seeing problems with human rights abuses. I mean, I think one of the factors that's led to kind of an increase is that in 2015, 2016, we had record economic migration figures globally. We had 244 million people who were economic migrants, and they're very much prone to, not only in agri-food, but in other industries as well, they're particularly vulnerable to gangmasters and so on and so forth. And we even see that obviously, even in Southern Europe, in the tomato industry, where economic migrants are facing quite, atrocious working conditions. Plus, you've got this social trend, which is digital transformation as well, which people will see as innovative. It's led to it's born some quite interesting businesses, but I think you also have to take a critical lens, because behind these platforms, you also have, employment conditions that are particularly difficult, and maybe people are suggesting that it could also lead to growing inequality in the workforce. If you think of some of the conditions that people are working under behind these particular digital platforms. Then we also have political instability. So increasingly, obviously, over the past 20, 30 years, the UK has sourced more food from other geographical territories. So at the moment, about 20 years ago, we were self-sufficient by about 66% of food, but now we're importing about 50% of our food into the United Kingdom, and 30% of that is coming from the European Union. And also, some of the big categories coming from the European Union are fresh fruit and vegetables. So we actually import 38% of our fresh vegetables from the European Union into the United Kingdom. If you look at fruit, it's actually 32% that comes in from the European Union. And if you think of fresh vegetables and fruit, those systems, those supply chains, have become very much just in time. So they rely on frictionless trade. If you're a supermarket retailer and you place an order on a Monday for leafy vegetables or for consignment of strawberries, they often appear in the supermarket depot either the next day or the day after. They call it day one for day 2 or day 1 for day 3. And so it's very, very much just in time. And so you can see that in addition to increases in global inequality, climate change, social trend of digital transformation, you've also got another potential stress on the UK food system, and that's the disruption caused by changes in trade terms. And so political instability, again, is a key factor potentially that's going to impact on the food system. There's a really good report last year, or actually 2 years ago, from Chatham House, and it was called Maritime Choke Points. And it also looked at other areas of political instability globally and some of the trade routes for food coming into Europe and the United Kingdom. So again, another potential shock and stress on the food system. This is all at a time when globally we're having to produce 60% more food by 2050. That's the kind of challenge that the global food system has to meet. Has to produce 60% more food by 2050. And if we actually produce that food using the same agricultural system, we'll need 120% more land, 42% more water, and that production alone will lead to a 2 degrees rise in global temperature. So it clearly can't be business as usual. And people are using this phrase, business unusual. And if you think that's the challenge, plus you have all these risks and shocks and stresses on the system, that's the reason why people are saying our food system is very vulnerable currently, because of what's expected of it and also the pressure on that particular system as well. And the IPCC are predicting that in terms of climate change, they're saying that sometime between 2030 and 2050, the global warming will reach 1.5 degrees centigrade. So again, another factor for us to consider in terms of risk. So people talk about, and I know Karina is very keen on using, and so is Annabelle, because I got this idea from Annabelle only recently, because I thought it was really useful, is what I've just described. If you think of the challenge, 50% more food by 60% more food by 2050. Plus, we can't use the same system to produce that food. In addition, all the shocks and stresses I've just covered, social as well as environmental, you can see that we're faced with some wicked problems and also some super wicked problems. So wicked problems are those problems where you need an interdisciplinary approach to solve them, because they kind of transcend different disciplinary boundaries. Plus, they transcend organisation, institutional, and also geopolitical boundaries, which I think I've just mapped out so far in the presentation. Then also, and I think probably climate change comes into this bracket, where you have these super wicked problems. Time is running out, no central authority, and those seeking to solve the issue are also causing it. And I think we all recognise that in this particular room this evening. So we have a big job, a big challenge, and I think that's why there's so much interest in food policy currently, because we're faced with these wicked or super wicked problems. So this is I mean, Karina said earlier that you'll see many different diagrams representing the food system, and this is just another one for you to consider and have a look at. It's very much based on previous depictions of the food system. So you can see here, you've got the activities from production all the way through to disposal and reuse, and then you've got the food system's outcomes: access, quality, availability, safety, utilisation, so on and so forth. And then you've got the drivers on the left-hand side. So you've got the environmental drivers and the socio-economic drivers, all interacting together to impact on the activities and the outcomes. And you've got these feedback loops going back to the drivers, the socio-economic and the environmental drivers. And Karina quite rightly pointed out to me about 6 weeks ago that climate change can also be an outcome of the food system, not necessarily a driver. So this is a dynamic kind of representation. It's on the move, it's changing, but I think it's useful. It's a nice conceptual framework to look at food through. Because why do I say that? It's because often what you get in organisations and also in governments, you get compartmentalisation. So you get some people who look at the food chain, you get some people who look at drivers, and you get some other people who look at the outcomes. And you get very much a silo mentality. And they don't necessarily talk to each other. So I think what's useful about this conceptual framework is that it allows people to see the whole picture, the whole holistic system of food. And it enables you to look at the connectivity, the interlinkages, the potential integration. It also allows you to look at where you could intervene and certain levers. So I think it's useful from that perspective as well. What I've done differently here with this particular diagram is, which I think was a weakness of other depictions of the food system, is I've added governance and power into the diagram, because as I've already pointed out, growing global inequality, the declining value that smallholders are gaining from the food system, down by 26% over the past 10 years, indicates, and you've got gender, obviously issues as well, gender inequality. You realise that you need to also look at issues of governance and power within the food system as well. What I also think is why you need to look at governance is because over the past 15 years, there's been very much a proliferation of private standards in the food system, and I think you can't ignore that when you're looking at food policy. Those private standards, they're not government standards, they're private standards. So when I say that, I mean you've got company-owned schemes. I can name a raft of company-owned schemes. You've got trade association schemes. You've got third-party schemes, third-party certification, like fair trade, for example. I mean, some of these standards have actually been very useful in raising behaviour and performance around responsibility and governance in food. But you can't ignore them if you're looking at the food system. They're very, very important and play an increasingly important role in power relationships and also behaviour and responsibility within the food system. So I think it's a useful model a useful conceptual framework to view food policy through, because it also, I think, allows you to do two other things which I haven't mentioned yet. It allows you to look at trade-offs, because if it can't be business as usual and it has to be business unusual, there will be some winners and there'll be some losers, and that's a given. It also allows you to maybe look for some complementarities and synergies, some win-wins. I think there are a few of those that have yet to come to the fore. And it also allows you to look at any unintended consequences of policy making within the food system, because it enables you to look at the whole holistic framework. So it's actually very, very useful in terms of helping us to frame and think about some of the issues that face us in terms of the challenges. And I certainly find it very useful using this framework within DEFRA since the 1st of April, when I was seconded in as a fellow. And one of our objectives is to embed this kind of thinking, or this framework, within the decision-making of DEFRA, not only DEFRA, but also other government and cross-government alliances and cross-government working parties as well. I'm sure there'll be questions about this later, but certainly it gives you a good tool to use in making sense of some of the challenges within the food system. This is another way of looking at a food system. So this is more of rather than the diagram I've just presented, this is more of a rich picture approach to the food system. And I personally quite like this, because it's drawn by the stakeholders, it's drawn by the people who are part of the food system. And this is a result of a workshop that took place about 18 months ago. Anyway, because there's no prize for the answer, but this is a question. Does anybody know what part of geographically, what part of the world this is depicting? So you've got regional city here in the lowland, and then in the uplands you've got deforestation taking place because of animal feed maize production, and that animal feed maize production is fueling and is supplying the kind of increase in meat consumption, not only in this geographical part of the world, but also this part of the world supplies a lot of poultry meat also to the United Kingdom. So does anybody know where this is depicting, representing? Philippines? No, and they're getting quite warm. Thailand. Who said Thailand? Yeah, great answer. It is. So that regional city is Chiang Mai. If there's some divine chocolate, you get that prize. So that regional city is Chiang Mai, and then you've got the uplands of northern Thailand, which border the Myanmar border, and in that area you've got ethnic groups like the Coherent and the Aka, and they're all caught in this trap of contract farming maize for animal feed production, and they're increasingly in debt because the inputs have increased in price. And if you actually take some photographs of the landscape and you take them from above, and I've got some very scary photographs of really big areas of soil erosion as well. It's pretty horrific, and what you get from the burning of the maize is, if you go to Chiang Mai in April and May time, you get this smog, and you see school children walking, hundreds of school children walking around with these masks. This is in 21st century. Now, originally the Chiang Mai population blamed the farmers, blamed the smallholder farmers who often don't have any land tenure anyway, in this part of the world because they're ethnic groups. They don't have a right to land tenure in northern Thailand. They were blaming the farmers for the burning of the maize. But in fact, if you take a food systems approach, you realise that these farmers are caught up in contractual arrangements with companies like CP Foods, Beta Grow, and you see that there's more of you see more of the kind of holistic picture of why this region of the world has found itself in this particular situation. And it's globally connected because it's fueling a kind of industry, poultry industry, that's also supplying Europe and the United Kingdom and also the United States as well. So yeah, this is the beauty of the food systems approach. And the problem with this maize is it causes terrible asthmatic problems in young children and also in the elderly, and you get an increasing health costs. If you go to the local hospital in April and May, the doctors are really tearing their hair out because it's a real severe shock to health in that particular region. Anyway, that gives you an idea of, this is another area of our own work within the I Know Food programme at the University of York, which is a global food security funded programme, as Karina said. By taking a food systems approach, we've also been able to unpack the problems within the soy supply chain. And if you look on our website, we've just produced a video which uses a food systems approach to unpack the problems in the soy supply chain. Now, interesting thing about soy is that 75% of the soy that we import in the United Kingdom is used in animal feed. That's soy, and we've developed a model called Trace, which actually enables you to look at the impact of consumption in the UK on environmental deforestation and environmental impact like biodiversity loss in certain parts of sub-regional level within Brazil. And what's interesting about soy is it's invisible to the consumer because it's not on the labelling. You know, when you buy your chicken or your pork or whatever in the supermarket, it doesn't tell you how that animal was fed and what conditions, what impact that soy supply chain has on particularly the Cerrado and also the Amazon in Brazil. So again, another great example of the value of a food systems approach. So a bit more about the rationale for a food systems approach. As I've already said, it can avoid kind of leading to some negative unintended consequences if you take a food systems approach. Often policies quite fragmented and the evidence gathered is sometimes siloed and fragmented. So I think this is useful. It also talks about the fact that a lot of resources, finance is wasted if you don't get your policy right and don't look at the whole holistic picture. And again, another argument for a more structured approach to policy coherence. So I think taking a food systems approach, even though I pointed out some of the areas of weakness, it's got a lot of potential in this particular space of policy making. So let's have a look at the UK food system. I said at the start I start global and then go more local. I just want to point out a few structural areas for us to concern ourselves in the UK food system. If we take this is just looking at the activities. I'll look at the drivers in a minute, but just in terms of the activities, we have an ageing farming population. Less than 3% of our farmers are less than 35, which is kind of an interesting statistic. Also, our process and manufacturing base is very much SMEs. 97% of the businesses within processing and manufacturing are small, medium-sized enterprises. They're not the largest representation in terms of turnover, but if you're developing policy in this space, you have to, in your industrial strategy, you have to consider small, medium-sized enterprises. Also, obviously we have a very much concentration at retail level. We import 70% of our food from the European Union. Yeah, of the imports, 70% comes from the European Union. Not what is consumed of the imports, that's why it's different from the figure previously. 60% of our exports are exported to the European Union. Whiskey is 4.5 billion, is food and drink. in terms of food, probably the categories that we import the most are fruit and vegetables is actually the largest category of imported food from the European Union, fruit and vegetables. And we have nearly 66.5 million consumers. And this is the economy of the food system. You can see the different values at different parts of those activities. So, interesting that 9.2 billion economic value from farming. That's about 60-40 livestock versus crop. So I think that's also important when you're thinking about policy in the food system. And 50% of actually UK farmers have an income less than 20,000 in terms 20,000 sterling. You've obviously got a raft of environmental costs. I'm not going to go through them all, but I'll point out soil degradation costs up to the UK farming industry up to 1.4 billion pounds a year. And then you've got key pathways in terms of distribution. So a lot of people think that actually retail is the largest segment, but actually out of home is 32.76 billion. So Sodexo, Pret a Manger, McDonald's, blah, 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 higher than UK food retail. So when you're setting policy, and the complexity is important to understand. And then consumption, 220 billion, but obviously we know that waste costs 20 billion, obesity at least costs 27 billion, and diabetes 10 billion. So you've got these costs and you've got these values, all important considerations when you're setting policy within the UK food system. But saying that, let's not forget, this is the manufacturing sector that's the largest in the United Kingdom. It's bigger than automotive. It's bigger than aviation. In total, it's 113.2 billion, and it employs 3.95 million people. So there's no wonder why there's so much interest in the research and policy and activities within the food system. This is businesses, so I'm breaking down those small, medium-sized enterprises a little bit further. This is very useful data from the Food and Drinks Federation, which shows you that of those 6,772 SMEs, how you categorise them in terms of numbers. So baking is by far the largest single segment. Other food products include sugar confectionery, chocolate confectionery, ready-made meals, and also tea and coffee. That's what that category represents. It's the largest number. But again, this data is important when you're setting industrial strategy in particular. Not only at a national level, but also at a regional, local economic partnership level and at a local council level. And that's also important in policy making, is the issue of scale. You need to also, not only looking at the food as a system, but also looking at the different scales, geographical scales, so on and so forth, and different governmental scales. So resilience, I think I've got okay for time. Karina?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So just unpacking resilience a little bit, because it's quite interesting over the past 3 or 4 years. You've seen an increasing use of this term resilience, and in fact, I was even with talking to my daughter who's just finished her A-levels just a week ago, and even in their last year of A-level studies, they even had resilience training. The school actually called it resilience training. So it's kind of a term that's permeated industrial kind of language, policy, and also academic research as well. And I just want to unpack it a little bit. There's a few experts in the room on resilience, but I guess in broad terms there are two important interpretations of resilience. One is the engineering perspective, which is often used in supply chain and logistics as disciplines, and also in disaster preparedness as well, or disaster management. And that is how quickly your system returns to the previous state. And often sometimes people call it the steady state. It's not easy in food because food is very much a living organic system, and so it's got limitations. This particular interpretation of resilience, I think, when you're looking at the food system. Also, I think one of the issues with resilience is that it assumes that the steady state is desirable. So return to that steady state. Is that really a desirable state? You know, if you think that we have to a certain extent, we have to see transformation in our food system for it to tackle the challenges we discussed, is that steady state? Is that kind of interpretation of resilience? Is it fit for purpose? Question mark. We prefer, in our own work within the I Know Food programme, because food is very much a living organic system, we prefer more a socio-ecological approach to resilience, which is about, you know, adaptation, transformation, maybe moving to a different equilibria after you've received the shock or the stress. There's obviously different resilient behaviours. One is robustness, one is recovery, one is reorientation and reorganisation. And I would say that kind of reorganisation and reorientation is maybe where the trajectory should be. But I think one of the other problems with resilience is it doesn't consider how did we get to this particular state in the first place. You know, who are the actors that created the system? It doesn't really challenge that question, how did we arrive at this particular state? So I think resilience is very useful because it's kind of nice property or potential property of the food system. We just have to be a little bit critical when we're using it and when we're looking at it as a theoretical construct, theoretical concept. Systems research program. So bearing all that in mind, and I started global and came down to local. On the 1st of April, before that, the Chief Scientist's Office at DEFRA, run by Ian Boyd, who's the Chief Scientist, decided to set up a systems program team within DEFRA. And you would have seen the advertisements if you're interested in this space. They advertise for 6 different academic policy fellows to be seconded into DEFRA for at least a year to help with a number of different areas. And here's the team. So some of these names you will recognise. I'm looking after food systems. You've got Abigail McQuatters-Gollop from Plymouth, who's responsible for marine. You've got Sarah Moller from the University of York, who's responsible for atmospheric pollution, things like ammonia. You have also Frank Boones from the University of Manchester, responsible for waste and resources, runs the Sustainable Consumption Institute at Manchester Business School. And then you also have Tom Oliver, who's a kind of systems design, applied ecologist from Reading, and Pam Berry, also from Oxford, who's looking at rural land use. And we're all working together, looking at, obviously, policy within those subsystems, but also working on cross-cutting themes, which I'm going to come to in a moment. And that's the team. Some of us started on the 1st of April, and some of us started on the 1st of May. Obviously, one of the reasons for bringing this team together is that a lot of it is expected of government, but particularly DEFRA currently. Because if you look, it's quite a historical moment for food and agriculture within the United Kingdom, because never before has DEFRA really had such a raft of bills and strategies underway at the same time. So you've got the 25-year environment plan and its implementation, and the environmental land management scheme that will replace CAP. You've got clean air strategy. You've got the new resources and waste strategy. You've got the agricultural bill. You've got an environmental bill being developed, and to top it all, you've got the development of a new national food strategy, which I think actually will be launched this week, potentially. Yeah. So there's a lot going on, and I think that was one of the justifications for bringing some extra resource into DEFRA. Now, we're not expecting, one of our objectives actually is to embed a systems thinking within DEFRA, is to develop a toolkit, and is also to support different directorates and different policy teams in taking more of an holistic approach. We don't expect everybody in DEFRA to be a systems thinker, but just to be aware that their place and their position within developing this new approach. Also, that's the other thing I didn't say about a systems approach, is that it allows you to take more of a multi-stakeholder participatory approach. So we're very keen on engaging with local government, regional government, but also the academic community and business and the third sector and citizens. So I think citizens and civil society are very important, parts of the work in terms of the landscape. If you look at DEFRA, DEFRA works and its stakeholder partners there are a number of different stakeholder partners that DEFRA works with. So it can't only be a systems approach. It can't only exist within DEFRA. It's also got to exist across government. So I think this is an interesting. These are all the different government departments that actually have an potential impact on the food system. Now, only 2 of them have got the word food in them, but they all have an impact on the UK food system. So one of the things I would like to do is get more of a cross-government cross-government food systems working party around these particular challenges. And if you think of food security and the definition of food security, you need really all these different stakeholders, different government departments, as well as industry, as well as local government, as well as civil society working together. It's not it's a big challenge. So what are we doing? So my job from the 1st of May has been kind of twofold really. One is getting involved in a lot of live policy making. So commenting on documents, future strategies, reviewing potential imminent policy, but also looking more at developing more long-term transformative work, such as developing a toolkit for policymakers, embedding a food systems approach within the department, and also improving the links with the academic community and also with the UK RI as well. Because I think there was a feeling in DEFRA that those 2 areas could be bolstered and strengthened. And they're very, very keen on working with the Global Food Security Programme, very, very keen on working with IFSTEL, and also very, very keen on working with NA Agri-Food as well. They want to kind of increase that collaborative approach to policy making. And I think that's encouraging for us all in this particular room. That's... So, a very senior civil servant said to me, "You've got 2 exam questions, Bob, in this particular space." And he said, he looked at me right in the eye and said, "These are the 2 exam questions." And he said, "How do you deliver a healthy, nutritious diet from a sustainable food system that is affordable and to high welfare standards?" So that's that kind of key question. It's multifactorial, and sustainable is social, economic and environmental. It's not just economic. Yeah, it's the 3 pillars of sustainability. And also, what is the optimum land use to balance production, environmental sustainability and thriving rural communities? We'll maybe talk about those in the panel. So some things to watch out for, just finally. Some things, I'm always looking for areas of innovation and areas of unpacking what's going on in the food system. And there's some really, really amazing work taking place by Professor Sarah Bridle at Manchester, who's actually an astrophysicist. She normally looks up into the sky, but she's decided to look down. And she's been coding lots and lots of different databases. And actually her objective is to give the consumer more information in terms of choice when faced, if consumers are interested in climate change, which increasingly obviously people are, then there's a lack of information to allow people to make the choices they want to make. And she's actually launching this initiative called Taking a Bite Out of Climate Change at the Royal Society exhibition starting on Monday here in London. I encourage you to go along. And she's also developed a game and also a top trumps card game. I'm old enough to remember what top trumps are. But so it actually is quite an interesting way of giving consumers more information. Certainly a really good project in the Global Food Security Programme called RURban. So bringing the rural into the urban and seeing if that can have an impact not only on food production but health and well-being as well. And so that's an interesting, led by Jess Davis at Lancaster and also Charlotte Hardman at Liverpool. And also the Lancet report, I think, gives us a really interesting guide in terms of dietary and sustainable food system guide. And obviously one of the owners, one of the contributors to that report was Tim Lang, who's obviously, eminent and one of the reasons for why you do what you do here at City University in such an expert way. So in summary, it's a very rapidly evolving landscape, but we do need more effective policy making. And I think I've mapped out today the challenges, but also some of the tools that could help that more effective policy making. Obviously, you've got systems thinking is important for effective, transformative, coherent policies. I think coherence is important. Thinking of the trade-offs and unintended consequences. There's an excellent opportunity for multidisciplinary evidence. From programs like the Global Food Security Programme, and also from citizens, industry, third sector, and academia as well. Key questions: how do we facilitate a seamless flow of evidence from UK R&D community to policymakers? And how can we improve our engagement with academia and all the different parts of civil society, third sector, and also the industrial base as well in the food system? So I think I've probably gone over my time, but what I wanted to do was just start global and move more down into the United Kingdom to show you some of the challenges and give you a little bit of information on the new systems program team at DEFRA, which is an interesting resource for those people involved in coherent policy making. Thank you very much. Thanks to Karina for inviting me along, and sorry I covered so much ground in a short space of time. Thank you very much.
Well, that was great. Can I invite Rebecca Wells and Kelly Parsons to come and respond to what you've said just in a few minutes, and then we'll go to some questions. If you'd like to join them at the panel there. So Rebecca Wells is a teaching fellow here at the Centre for Food Policy, and Kelly Parsons is a research fellow at the Centre for Food Policy and co-authors on the brief that I mentioned earlier. So please do go ahead and give your comments. Here is the microphone.
Thanks, Corinna, and thank you, Bob, for a really interesting talk and a really interesting insight into DEFRA and the work that you're doing there, and the National Food Strategy, which we're all excitedly anticipating. And thanks to Corinna for asking me to respond today. So I was really pleased to see that food systems, as a sort of food systems teaching fellow on the IFSTAR programme, really pleased to see that at the heart of your presentation, and also to see this at a high level in DEFRA, being introduced at a high level. I think obviously we need to think more holistically, and we've known this at the Centre for a long time. A lot of the work that we've been doing, both under Corinna and under Tim Lang, her predecessor, has thought about this, about holistic ways of thinking about the food system, of joining up the dots. One of the things I feel is that we generally need to think more carefully about how we define a food systems approach, and that's one of the things that we tried to do in the brief that, as Corinna mentioned, is out today. I think there's no clear or agreed definition, or there hasn't been up until now a way to tackle this from a policy perspective, and so that's a really kind of welcome development to think about that. And for example, at the EU Food 2030 meeting in Plovdiv last year, there was a lot of talk about food systems. Almost everybody talked about food systems and food systems approaches from many different governments. How they actually defined that was much less clear. So what does a food systems approach mean? There were people talking about the food systems activities that you talked about, Bob, so in essence what you might call the food chain. and how that is linked and whether it's linked up, and that being a food systems approach, but they certainly weren't talking about the much broader way that we've been thinking about it, and that obviously from your diagram you've been thinking about socioeconomic, environmental, political aspects of that, how that impacts on the food system, or how they might be both outcomes and drivers on the food system. So I think there's a real need for a clearer definitions that people can work to if we're going to take this food systems approach going forward, which obviously a lot of people are doing. To add to that, in terms of the IF-style experience and my experience of teaching food systems here, I think the food systems approach and systems thinking are two sort of separate but distinct but linked areas, and I think it's really important that we think about that. So there's the food systems approach, which I would see as looking at the food system as a whole and looking at it holistically, and then there's the sort of systems thinking, which offers a way of dealing with this complexity. So once you've looked at everything and you've looked at the whole system and you've seen it's complex and you've seen it involves almost everything that you can think of, and if you map it you get these massive spaghetti diagrams. How do we then think about this in a way of dealing with some of these massive food challenges? How do we isolate some of the problems? How do we draw boundaries around them? How do we think about that? And that's where I see systems thinking coming in terms of how we can then identify those problems. So I think there's a kind of distinct way. And also I think systems thinking isn't the only way to deal with these global food challenges. So I think there are kind of two approaches there in a way that you've mentioned, Bob. The third point, and this kind of draws on my own background as a journalist and my research work, my PhD on communication and media, is around how we communicate this more widely. And you talk, Bob, about who we need to engage with, who are the stakeholders that we need to be talking to, and bringing in lots of people from the food sector, which again is really welcome. How do we bring people together to address some of these tensions that we know there are in the food system between industry and civil society, academia, politics, government? And how we might do that. Obviously, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think education has a huge role to play. So, the kinds of programs that we run here, obviously masters programs, also in schools and universities, CPD courses, bringing people together, bringing different sectors together to try and think about these things in the way that you've mentioned. I really liked your rich picture and your description of how that came about, which is really, really interesting. So I think there's a huge role also for communicators, media, health educators, press officers, all those people to be involved at an early stage. If we expect people to take on board these policies and new ways of thinking, then we need to really think about how we're going to communicate to them in a transparent way why we're doing this, why it is that we want them to reduce their meat consumption, why we want farmers to stop producing less meat if we want them to do that, if we think that's a good policy option going forward. So thank you. Thank you for a really stimulating, interesting talk. And I'll hand over to Kelly for her thoughts.
Thank you very much. So I'm Kelly Parsons. I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Food Policy. Thank you for your talk, Bob.
Thank you
very much. It's very interesting. One of the reflections I have is your big question about how to best organise government departments, which has been a big focus of my work in terms of governance structures for food policy, and your idea that the policy process should work in a way that takes an overall systems approach. And probably don't need to say this to the room here, but obviously the challenge is that that's kind of the antithesis of how modern governments are organised in terms of food policy. According to their separate policy domains and responsibilities, they're incentivised to focus on their own goals and not a kind of overarching system goal. And there's also increased amount of project-based working, which is quite problematic in terms of long-term systems thinking kind of approaches. So one of the outcomes of the work I've done most recently at mapping how food policy is made in the UK is noting that there's really very few formal mechanisms at all for linking across government or at the kind of multi-level. So it's fantastic to have your programme that's kind of being able to pull those strands of work together and potentially a cross-government food systems working group. I guess my question is, what will be the legacy of that? How long-term can that be? We've had more formal mechanisms in the past when we've had integrated food policy projects, and they've come and gone. So I think it's really important that the kind of systems thinking understanding provides a kind of legacy that can last longer than these mechanisms, which don't tend to be retained when governments change, etc. The other thing I would say is that in terms of this this thing that Rebecca mentioned about having more of a clarity on a food systems approach. I think it's really important. One, because I would say that probably most governments aren't really even joined up in terms of the food chain, in terms of the different links in the chain and the different departments dealing with different areas of the chain. So I think it's quite a leap to go from that to an even broader kind of focus on the food system. And I think another challenge for policymakers that I've noted is that a lot of the discussion is at a very top level. It's quite general. So I think from my experience, I think there are three things that we need to kind of translate this food systems approach and give it the best chance of success. So one of them is one that you and Rebecca both talked about in terms of the shared understanding of the food system. I think that's really important. I think there's lots of projects going on at the moment at different levels of government trying to create a vision, a shared vision for the food system. I think one of the things that maybe gets missed off is that they're not always based in a kind of robust evidence review of what the food system looks like in a particular country or city, and I certainly don't think they're often based on a review of what food policy looks like in that place. So I think those visions really need to be grounded in a good, robust evidence base about those two different things. So that leads me on to my other two recommendations. One of them is about analysis of how coherent policies are. So there's a lot of high-level discussion about joined-up policy, but very little documented at a more granular level about where the disconnection and clashes are. And I think if we're serious about demonstrating the strength of a systems approach, about identifying trade-offs and avoiding unintended consequences, we need to basically have a better evidence base so we can make that case about those policy interconnections. And I think there's a lot of groups out there at the moment who are working on food systems, particularly at the European level, who are really looking for more of an evidence base in that way. I think there's relatively little work that's been done on policy coherence on food. I think Professor Corinna Hawkes' work on nutrition and trade is one example. We've seen some policy coherence analysis coming out recently from the European Commission on climate change and agriculture, but I think we've been working at the centre, we've been working with the OECD's Policy Coherence for Sustainable Development Unit, who've done a lot of work on policy coherence over the years, and with our master's students on analysing the coherence of different policies and creating methodologies to do that. And I think that's going to be a growing area of evidence that we need to build. And then finally, I think we need to know much more about how food policy is made. I think in most countries, we don't really know unless we're directly involved. And even then, if you are directly involved, you don't necessarily have an overarching view. And I'd argue you have to be an investigative journalist to basically find out how food policy is being made. I mean, that was my job before I became an academic, so it's a bit easier for me to do. But I don't think we should have to tease out what policies are related to the food system, who's doing them, who's working with who. I don't think that should be so difficult. One example is the recent Canadian National Food Policy that was launched last week. It's a very short document of 13 pages. It's got some great ideas in it, but no idea what's going on behind the scenes or what's actually going to happen, who was involved. It's very difficult to get transparency on how food policy is made. And until we do that, I don't think we're going to get this mandate to everyone to get on board and for stakeholders to be engaged in the system. So, yeah.
Thank you for those reflections. So we've got some thinking time to do. Sometimes with these kinds of conversations, you think, my goodness, it's so big and massive, and there's so many challenges, and there's so many connections. But in fact, what we're trying to do is profoundly practical. We're trying to solve problems in a more effective way. So please, comments and reflections from the floor about how this approach can be used to go forward and provide those solutions and identify those solutions. Could you say your name and institution if you have one? Do I need the mic? Fine.
Eleanor Boyle, visiting from Canada. That's loud. To me, one of the beauties of a food system approach is that it allows us to see all of the parts and to ask, where are the opportunities for change? Where are the vulnerabilities? Where are the points for most effective intervention? Absolutely essential to look at it that way. And a number of people have mentioned meat, and you mentioned feed. One of the biggest changes we need to make in our food system: less intensive meat and dairy production, much less meat consumption on the part of consumers. I'm part of activist groups that have been working on this for years, and decades actually, and quite a number of us years ago saw that most governments didn't have the, may I say, courage to address the meat problem because it was just too politically difficult. So we've been working with consumers, educating people, and we or they have been quite successful. Meat consumption in industrialized countries is down, but as outlined in the latest Lancet report and many others, not by nearly enough. We all have to cut back by at least 50%. So I suppose I'd ask, with this really important change needed in the food system, because meat produces by far the most greenhouse gases per calorie and so many other reasons, what are the other vulnerabilities or opportunities in the food system for lowering meat consumption and meat production?
So I'll just take 2 or 3 questions.
Thank you. Good evening. My name's Eric Millstone. I'm based at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. And there's an enormous amount that you said with which I agree, but inevitably, as an academic, I'm going to pick on the things where I'm quibbling. And the virtue of a systems approach is an alternative to a simple linear driver. Science drives technology, which drives economic change, which drives social change, or looked at it from the supermarket's point of view, consumer demand drives purchases of retailers, which influences what farmers grow, and so on. So you've got a systems approach, but the first of your 2 final questions falls into the trap of being linear, and isn't a question framed in a systems perspective. So much of UK R&D is framed in linear ways by scientists or nutritionists or epidemiologists who focus within one discipline, and typically the questions they address are not issues that engage directly with the considerations of policymakers. If you want the output of the research community to effectively enrich the perspectives of policymakers, it's necessary to change the way in which the research questions and the research approaches are framed in the first place. So if researchers aren't asking a policy-relevant question, the chances are that their findings will be relevant to policymakers. So, just one other point. Out of systems thinking, you often get a lot of argument in favour of integration. And you articulate that argument, let's bring all these departments related to food together in government and have an integrated approach. But surely the lesson of, for example, the UK BSE crisis, or salmonella in eggs, and all of those, was that the Ministry of Ag, Fish and Food, that was attempting simultaneously to look after the interests of producers and of consumers, ended up letting down all its constituencies and being a complete disaster. Which is why the Food Standards Agency was created, to take responsibility for regulation away from the Ministry of Ag, Fish and Food and separate it. Because the integration involved concealed policy compromises and unacknowledged trade-offs. So if you want integration where the Food Standards Agency sets the regulatory framework, and within that DEFRA tries to get farmers to produce in a sustainable way, okay. But if you just bring them together in a closed Whitehall meeting and all the departments compromise against each other, then once again we'll be back in the old trap of math and not satisfying any of the constituencies.
Hello, I'm from the United States, but I just moved here, and I work in sustainable food systems, and am recently I'm a recovering elected official as well. So in the United States, in about the last 10 years, the policy chops, so to speak, in food policy have really matured. In the rise, explosion of food policy councils at the local and state level, etc., training, advocacy, etc. But what my observation has been in the food system, sustainable food system world in the U.S. is that unlike many other issue sectors that very much not only have built their chops in policy but are also training people to be policy makers, in the food system we have a great void in building that pipeline. And having now spent 4 years as an elected official, outside of my food policy work, those things in your circles around power and governance, etc., really matter in terms of actually getting things done and not just being the research and the advocacy, etc. So I'm curious in the UK landscape what's happening to help people be trained to be policy makers, whether in that elected or administrative roles, and what that landscape is looking like, and especially sustainable and local and regional food policy.
Answers, please.
I've got a microphone anyway. Do you want to take the training question first?
Yeah.
And I'll do the others.
So just on your question around training, so obviously the Centre for Food Policy, there's a master's programme here. We have a lot of students probably already here, yes, and past students. And a lot of those will be going on to work in food policy. We've also been part of a training programme, the IFSTEL training programme, which we've talked about food systems, which is a cross-university training programme. And there are other programmes coming up that we've started developing programmes this year for professionals, CPD programmes for professionals working in the food system. Is that the kind of thing you meant?
So I'm asking not about that piece, I'm familiar with that piece, but training people to run for office, to be elected officials who have deep expertise in this space.
Interesting. Well, I guess, Bob, you might be able to talk more about that in terms of your own transition from academia into government.
I think that's not something I originally was my goal, and I don't think I think what's interesting is that the UK set up various different research programs, platforms. One is Global Food Security Programme, which takes money from lots of different sources, and it provides a fund and it's funded 13 different programs. And you've got other large programs like Innate Agri-Food, and then you've got IFSTEL. Innate Agri-Food is the Northern 8 research-intensive universities who all have come together to pool their resources to look at challenges in the food system. But then you've got IFSTEL, which is the Institute for Food Systems Training and Learning, Teaching and Learning, and that trains professionals as well as policymakers in taking a food systems approach. And what I do see, actually, within DEFRA and other government departments, is you'll be in a meeting with somebody and they'll say, yeah, I completely get food systems. I either was a student at the Centre for Food Policy at City University, or I've been on the IFSTEL training programme. But it's not training for, I guess, elected officials. I don't think that actually exists. Within academic programmes, there's an emphasis on impact. That academics have to have impact, and policy is one of those avenues. But certainly there's no formal, as I'm aware, kind of training for elected officials. Although one of my PhD students has just become a councillor, elected councillor, so she'll be an exception. But she's not the norm, I wouldn't say. So I don't know what your experience is in the US, whether you've been able to fill that void or not.
It's just the beginning of a narrative around how that happens. Because, for instance, what we would call big ag in the US very much is doing so. The environmental movement very much does so. Many other sectors, health and education, housing, train people so that they will, run for elected office. And food has been a void. So it's the very beginning of a conversation about that.
would say that there's a real movement in this country around local food, around local food councils and food groups, food partnerships, and from that, I think we may see then some activism that then turns into people running for office at a local level, which then may turn into them running for office. But I think it was certainly definitely needed, much needed.
So just coming to Eric's questions, which I think were really insightful. I completely agree. I think you need definitely an interdisciplinary approach. You know, you can't just take a kind of siloed view. And I think increasingly research funding is one of the criteria is an interdisciplinary approach. And if I take my own research program, I Know Food, it involves 5 different departments at York. You know, when I say departments, disciplinary departments, 3 different research institutes, and 3 other universities, Leeds, Manchester and Liverpool, psychology at Liverpool, engineering at Manchester, and business and behaviour, consumer behaviour at Leeds. I don't think you can do it any other way. I also agree with you that I think you need certainly a multi-stakeholder approach, certainly Food Standards Agency, DEFRA and other components. You would need all those people together, making those discussing the challenges and deciding what to do next. So I think you're completely right, and I take your point on the questions. Thank you very much, Eric.
Just going to come back on Eric's point about the. I just think what you're saying about MAF and the FSA it just highlights the awkwardness of fitting food in the current framework that we have. The fact that food policies may be coming from one department or another, there's no natural home, and I think these machinery of government changes that happen have big implications that often aren't thought through at the time because they're not done thinking about how food is divided up and what the unintended consequences of taking particular remits in or out of an agency or a department are. And I think that's going to be really, really vital to think about at the point when post-Brexit new governance bodies like the environment body that's been mooted are created, and also there's a lot of discussion about what the remit of the Food Standards Agency, which had its nutrition responsibilities removed in the past, and whether that will lead to a broadening out of the Food Standards Agency again, whether some of its responsibilities will in fact fold into other departments, as has happened in the past. And I think thinking through the longer term unintended consequences of those kinds of machinery of government changes in a kind of systems way is going to be really important.
So have I got time to make a couple more points? Yeah. So just again on Eric's point, I thought it was really interesting around the Food Standards Agency and MAF, and I think this comes again to the point around transparency in policy making and the Food Standards Agency's sort of more transparent approach. I mean, you could argue that perhaps then a lot of the decision making goes on behind closed doors, and what they do in a kind of open forum that's all recorded and you can watch it on the web stream, perhaps that leads to 2 levels of policy making, and you're not seeing the transparency, but you know, I think that there's a difference there, and perhaps we can learn something from that in terms of communication. Just to talk to Eleanor's point about meat and meat consumption, I think there's a real, from my own research, I'm aware of a real kind of cultural issue around that, and I think that's where sometimes the food systems approach can help. So quite often public health will say, well, we know that we have to reduce, some of my research has looked at red and processed meat and bowel cancer, so reduction of red and processed meat in order to reduce the risk of bowel cancer. But a lot of for example, the media coverage of that was very culturally focused. So it was around people's cultural love of bacon sandwiches or of a roast dinner or of and the kind of outrage that perhaps the policymakers hadn't thought about. They thought about it very much in health perspective, very much about the kind of micronutrients that we might need to reduce, and hadn't thought particularly about replacing things, how that might play culturally within the community. So I think there's a real kind of a communication issue there.
And I think just on Eleanor's question, I think the Lancet report is a very useful guide. I think having that balanced approach to healthy diet is important. Interesting, I was asked to respond to the Lancet report by CNN, and I wrote a positive report, but also some areas where it could have covered in a more stronger way, like governance and agency within the food system. But actually, they didn't publish it because it was too positive. So I think going back to Rebecca's point, there's a lot of negativity and a lot of, and I think reports like the Lancet report are really useful because they present the facts and it's a useful guide.
We are almost at 7 o'clock, but if there's a couple more points that want to be made, if you don't expect full responses, then that's fine. And there are more of the briefs at the back if anybody wants them. Heavens, there's suddenly a ton of questions. I know people might need to leave, but I don't want to stop the questions. So if you could just be very brief in the questions and perhaps just not expect an answer, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Alex from the Royal Society of Biology, and my question is in this quite complex diagram, and I'm very new to the field, so forgive my ignorance if that's the case. In this very complex scheme, what are the areas that you think are more data poor, where you would want to have more data in terms of modeling your food system? Are there any aspects that you feel you're less sure about? And the other question is from the DEFRA point of view of having a team like the one that you showed. Is there anything that the DEFRA would like to hear from the biologists in terms of evidence base? What kind of information they would value in their defining a national food strategy? Thank you.
Perhaps you can prepare some very quick answers to these questions. Did you have a question? Yes, I do.
Sandra from Stellenbosch University, South Africa. I just want to follow up on the animal food consumption. When you take out South Africa, almost all of Africa eats less ASF. So I want to find out if there is a change or a recommendation for modeling a new type of food pyramid that addresses some of the food system challenges, but also is aware of the lack of some food items for Africans. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I am a master's student here at Center for Food Policy. And I just want to say thank you guys for this really great discussion. I think you were all quite right in saying that it's on the cutting edge of a lot of different areas in academia right now. There's a lot that I could say, but for time I'm going to ask a really practical question about the National Food Strategy. So at the City Food Symposium we were talking about this a bit, and you raised the issue of scale in your talk here. But looking at a National Food Strategy, especially with things like the Good Food Nation policy and the Future Generations Act, and all of these other things coming out from devolved governments, would a national food strategy here from DEFRA's perspective be really an English food strategy, or would it be something that covers the entire UK, including Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland? I know you mentioned they were partners, but just on a practical level, how is that shaping out?
Hi everyone, I'm Ilva. I'm an ex-master student here as well, and I work for the Sustainable Restaurant Association. So just bringing back to sort of a bit more of a practical approach around the out-of-home sector, which we heard was one of the largest sort of influencers at the moment. So I'm meeting with about 15 of the sort of largest high street chains tomorrow, and just to talk about just this actually, because I think it's important that we sort of translate this into a language so they can understand. And I was just thinking of how, in terms of coherence, like how do we make this coherent for the different restaurants that are out there? So they often focus on the main key thing, which might be chicken, it might be fish and seafood, it might be dairy. And so what's most important? Is the plastic reduction to start with? Should you focus on meat reduction, food waste? What is the most urgent thing for them to do?
I think we have one last question over here.
My question is, I'm Alex Laird, I'm a medical herbalist, work in Whips Cross Hospital Dermatology in Breast Cancer Haven, and teach food and how people can look after themselves with food and herbs, plants and self-care. My question really is, the thing that seems to be missing, and I haven't been a student yet, from this wonderful diagram, and I'm all for systems thinking, because that's what health is about, is where is the role of, it seems to me, the supreme role, unfortunately, of the profit motive and capitalist, huge, big ag food companies, which surely are running this whole show, including all our governments. Am I wrong?
I think we do mention power on that diagram. Just some very, very quick responses.
In terms of your question from Alex, the biologist, I mean, there's loads of areas, but just one area we don't have a lot of data on is on-farm waste, food waste. Optimum land use, if you're going to deliver Lancet, food production to meet a Lancet health guideline diet, how does that impact on land use? That's quite an interesting question. I mean, we should have a more of an in-depth discussion, because there's lots of other. I'm not a biologist, but there's lots of interesting areas you could contribute to. In terms of Sustainable Restaurant Association, that sounds like a very important meeting. And I think it's more. I mean, it's no simple silver bullet. I don't think. I think it's across a number of different areas. I think single-use plastics. I was in a meeting today about waste in the out-of-home sector, which seems to not gain as much attention as in the retail sector. So I think that's probably an area that might be on the forefront of policy thinkers' minds. Certainly the kind of health agenda as well within that food offering is also important. Giving consumers a choice, rather than being stuck to a. So I think those are the two big issues, I would say, at the moment, but there's lots of other issues.
And do you want to? I don't know if you want to address Rachel's question around. Is the strategy, food strategy, going to be?
I think England probably in terms of the food strategy, probably Karina's better placed to answer that question, aren't you? I mean, I think it's just started. I mean, it's not even been launched yet, and it is about England, but it doesn't mean to say that it's not transferable to other geographical, places. And I think what it will try to do is create a national conversation around food, which I think is overdue. It's a long time. Well, I don't know whether Eric, you'll know whether the UK has ever had a national food strategy. No.
If I can just pick up on that, it's an interesting one, because technically it's England, and because Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland are meant to be kind of doing it themselves, but there's a real pushback to that, because there's a belief that we should be thinking as a whole nation, particularly coming from the farming sector and the industry. That's saying they don't want to be dealing with everything separate in separate countries, because it's one nation and we should be looking at it like that. So at the moment it's a fudge, and we'll see where it lands.
And in the past it's been fudged as well. We've had a previous food strategy in 2008-2010 which didn't get implemented. Our previous food strategy, which didn't get implemented, was in between 2008 and 2010, and it was a kind of fudge in there as well. So it talked about actions in England, but a strategy for the UK, which was sort of over. So the ideas are meant to be inspiring to other countries, other regions. Some of those regions have kind of then accelerated and kind of gone ahead. So I think it's probably a different scenario now. I'll just quickly, while I've got the mic, we'll come back on the point about the economic dimension. I mean, it is one of the sort of spheres on our map that we put in there, the kind of economic goals, the economic sort of issues. I think it does get left out quite a lot in terms of discussions about the balancing and trade-offs, and which is kind of ironic. And there's a lot of discussions going on and visions about healthy and sustainable food systems which don't actually acknowledge that most governments' primary profit is the primary motive in terms of the food production system. So.
Lastly, I just want to talk to Sandra's question around meat, and is there a pyramid that we can draw for that fits everybody? I think that was your question. But I think this is one of the difficulties with systems approaches and food systems approaches, and this is why in some ways you have to have those tools that say, well, how are we going to drill down into this, and what area is it that we're looking at? So you'd have to draw different food systems maps for different areas, and that's one of the things that we were hoping to be able to develop with the diagram that we've drawn, that you'll be able to look at different areas and say, well, what are the key characteristics of this area? How do we deal with that? How do we deal with the needs in terms of nutrition needs, in terms of what that impact would have on production within that system, within that locality? So you have different systems at different times, at different scales, different localities, different points of history. So it's very much, as Bob has said, a kind of complex adaptive system, and that's what makes it so complex in a way, makes it so complicated to deal with the kind of food challenges that we have. So I think that's in some ways where a food systems approach can help, but it's managing not to just get completely overwhelmed and think that we can have a silver bullet, one size fits all model. We have to take a systems approach to see the bigger picture, and then be able to use systems thinking to narrow down to what is it that we're actually looking at, what's the problem we're actually trying to solve. I hope that helps.
No, that's fine.
Thank you. I should add that Sandra's just done a microscopic analysis of food policy in South Africa, which is another example of a country that has a ton of food policy, but actually is it really having the impact it's meant to be having? Not really. And I think the UK is in a similar situation, and India is a similar country, and there are other countries where we have all of this food policy, but somehow it's not having the effect that we want it to have on the food system. And that's why we need to interrogate how we do food policy better. And in the implications for a fresh approach to food policy that we put in the brief here, we say that the basic implications are that there's many parts of the food system where action can be taken, but that policy actions in one part of the food system can have consequences, or unintended consequences, you put it, Bob. But there's lots of opportunities to develop policy solutions which address multiple policy at the same time if we actually get together and think about it. But last but not least, that knowledge about different parts of the food system needs to be brought together, and that's what's so really vital, to have these different types of knowledge in the room and stakeholders in the room if we're really going to find these kind of solutions. So thank you very much for your comments and questions. Thank you very much to the panellists, and thank you to Bob for your really stimulating presentation. This conversation will continue both at the Centre for Food Policy and around the world, and we look forward to being part of that conversation, and to you also. Thank you very much.